Picture this. You're standing in the shadows of St. Peter's Basilica as dawn breaks over Rome in the year 1503. The morning mist carries whispers through cobblestone street. They tell of a man who claimed to be Christ as representative on earth while orchestrating some of the most depraved spectacles in human history. A pope who turned the Vatican into his personal pleasure palace and transformed sacred halls into stages for unspeakable acts that would make emperors of ancient Rome seem like choir boys by comparison. The man they whisper about is Pope Alexander VI, and what you're about to discover will forever change how you view the seat of papal power. This isn't just another story of historical corruption. This is the tale of how one man's twisted desires nearly destroyed the Catholic Church from within, culminating in an evening so scandalous that Vatican archivists have spent 5 centuries trying to bury the evidence. The story begins not with a monster, but with a man named Rodrigo Borgia, born in Spain on New Year's Day 1431. His childhood was unremarkable, spent in dusty Spanish villages where the most excitement came from market days and religious festivals. But destiny had carved out a very different path for young Rodrigo, one that would lead him through the marble corridors of power straight into the darkest chapters of papal history. Everything changed when his uncle Alfonso became Pope Calixtus III in 1455. Suddenly, 24-year-old Rodrigo found himself catapulted into the Vatican's inner circle, appointed as a cardinal not through any divine calling or theological brilliance, but through pure nepotism. The church had become a family business, and Rodrigo was about to learn how to exploit every opportunity that position could provide. Rome in the late 15th century was a city living a double life that would have impressed the most skilled actors. During daylight hours, pilgrims filled the streets, their voices raised in prayer as they sought salvation at sacred shrines. But when darkness fell, those same streets transformed into a marketplace where everything had a price, including forgiveness and eternal salvation itself. The papal court had evolved into something that resembled a royal palace more than a religious institution, where gold flowed as freely as holy water and moral boundaries dissolved like morning fog. Rodrigo understood this world better than most newcomers. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's desires and weaknesses, using that knowledge to accumulate wealth and influence with the precision of a master chess player. His lifestyle became legendary throughout Rome for all the wrong reasons. Lavish feasts that lasted until dawn, magnificent palaces filled with priceless art, and a parade of mistresses who provided him with children as regularly as the changing seasons. The most significant of these relationships was with Vannazza Catene, a Roman noblewoman whose intelligence matched her striking beauty. Between 1474 and 1482, she bore Rodrigo 4 children who would become central players in the dark drama about to unfold across Italy. Juan, Cesare, Lucretia, and Jaffer represented more than just offspring to their ambitious father. They were living chess pieces in his grand strategy for power, their lives destined to be sacrificed on the altar of his overwhelming ambition. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's behavior shocked Rome, which was no small accomplishment in a city where scandal was as common as bread at breakfast. Pope Pius II felt compelled to write him a scathing letter in 1460, condemning conduct that had scandalized an entire town. But shame was a luxury Rodrigo couldn't afford. He had his sights set on the ultimate prize, and moral considerations were simply obstacles to overcome rather than principles to honor. The papal conclave of August 1492 unfolded like an elaborate auction where souls were the currency and the papacy was the prize. Behind the closed doors of the Sistine Chapel, 23 cardinals gathered ostensibly to choose Christ's next representative on earth. In reality, they were participating in one of history's most brazen examples of institutional corruption. Gold changed hands with fluid efficiency, promises were traded like commodities, and church positions were distributed as if they were party favors. When the smoke finally cleared on August 11th, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI, having achieved victory through what everyone openly acknowledged was simony, the buying and selling of religious offices. The Romans, surprisingly, celebrated this outcome. They had grown comfortable with their Spanish cardinal and anticipated a pontificate filled with the kind of magnificent spectacle that Renaissance Italians craved. Bonfires illuminated the 7 hills of Rome that night. Torchlight processions wound through ancient streets, while triumphal arches rose from the enthusiasm of citizens who believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. Alexander's coronation at St. Peter's Basilica on August 26th drew what observers described as the most enthusiastic reception any pope had ever received. The new pope began his reign with reforms that seemed to promise genuine change. He restored order to Rome's violent streets, where over 200 assassinations had occurred in just the months before his election. He established administrative districts with magistrates empowered to maintain peace, and personally held court every Tuesday to hear grievances from ordinary citizens. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that divine providence had placed exactly the right man on the throne of St. Peter. But power, like strong wine, has a way of revealing character rather than creating it. Alexander's initial reforms were quickly overshadowed by his relentless campaign to advance his children's fortunes, particularly his sons, Juan and Cesar. Juan was elevated to Duke of Gandia and married into Spanish royalty, while 18-year-old Cesare received the prestigious Archbishopric of Valencia before being made a cardinal. These weren't sacred callings, but rather stepping stones in Alexander's grand design for dynastic power. The papal apartments during Alexander's reign transformed into something that belonged more in a decadent imperial court than the heart of Christendom. Dinner parties stretched deep into the night, featuring entertainment that pushed every boundary of acceptable behavior. Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, moved through Vatican corridors with the freedom of any cardinal, her presence serving as a constant reminder that the Pope as spiritual vows meant nothing when earthly desires beckoned. Into this world of contradictions stepped Johannes Burchard, a meticulous German cleric whose obsession with documentation would preserve the most shocking secrets of Alexander's papacy. Born around 1450, Burchard had climbed the ecclesiastical ladder through sheer competence, eventually becoming papal master of ceremonies. This position granted him unprecedented access to the Vatican's most private moments, while simultaneously making him nearly invisible to those whose secrets he was recording. Burchard possessed the soul of an accountant and the observational skills of a court reporter. His diary, written in precise Latin, captured both magnificent religious ceremonies and scandalous papal conduct with the same clinical detachment. He recorded Alexander's reign with unflinching accuracy, creating a documentary record that would eventually make even hardened Vatican archivists uncomfortable when they discovered what their predecessors had witnessed. The master of ceremonies occupied a unique position within the papal hierarchy. He was important enough to witness everything, but not powerful enough to participate in the corruption surrounding him. Like a shadow cast by candlelight, Burchard moved through the Vatican's most secret spaces, observing everything while appearing to matter very little to those whose behavior he was documenting. By the late 1490s, the Borgia family's conduct had begun attracting negative attention throughout Europe. Alexander's eldest son, Juan, had proven himself incompetent as a military commander and cruel in his personal dealings. Stories circulated about his sexual excesses and violent temperament, making him a liability that even his devoted father struggled to defend. Everything changed on June 14, 1497, when Juan's body was discovered floating in the Tiber River, his throat cut and bearing 9 separate wounds. The murder sent shockwaves through Rome and struck Alexander with grief so profound that observers wondered if divine justice had finally visited the Borgia family. For 3 days and nights, the Pope refused food and sleep, weeping behind closed doors, like a broken man, rather than the mighty pontiff who had once intimidated kings. In his anguish, Alexander announced sweeping church reforms. He called for measures to restrain papal court luxury, reorganize church administration, and suppress the buying and selling of religious offices that had characterized his own rise to power. For a brief moment, personal tragedy seemed capable of accomplishing what years of criticism had failed to achieve. But grief, like everything else in Alexander's character, proved temporary. Within months, the reform proposals were quietly shelved, filed away like embarrassing reminders of weakness. The Pope's attention turned to his surviving children, particularly Cesare, whose iron will and ruthless ambition would now drive the family agenda forward with renewed intensity. If Juan had been Alexander's heart, Cesare was definitely his sword, sharp, cold, and utterly without moral constraints. Tall, handsome, and possessed of intelligence that bordered on genius, Cesare had initially been destined for church service like his father. But his talents lay in warfare and political manipulation rather than theology. In 1498, he made history by becoming the first cardinal ever to voluntarily abandon sacred office, setting his sights instead on secular power. The political landscape of Italy provided Cesare with opportunities that would have challenged even Machiavelli's imagination. The French king needed papal approval for a marriage annulment, while various Italian duchies stood ripe for conquest by a sufficiently ruthless commander. Alexander saw in these circumstances a golden opportunity to create a kingdom for his son, even if it meant allying with foreign invaders against fellow Italians. Through a devastating combination of siege warfare, targeted assassinations, and brilliant political manipulation, Cesare carved out a domain in central Italy that made him one of Europe's most powerful men. His methods proved so effective that Niccolò Machiavelli would later use him as the model for his famous work. The prince, admiring Cesare's ability to combine calculated cruelty with ruthless efficiency in pursuit of political goals. Such ambitious military campaigns required enormous resources that even papal coffers struggled to provide, leading Alexander to increasingly creative fundraising methods. The systematic sale of indulgences, church offices, and cardinal appointments became standard practice during his later years. Wealthy families could essentially purchase salvation along with social status for their sons, while the College of Cardinals expanded based on financial contribution rather than spiritual merit. Rome during this period resembled a city under occupation by its own rulers. The Borgia family treated the Papal States as their personal kingdom, with Alexander serving as patriarch and Cesare as crown prince. Even Lucretia, despite later attempts to rehabilitate her reputation, was used as a political pawn in marriage alliances that served family interests rather than her personal happiness. The Vatican apartments became a stage for increasingly elaborate entertainments that tested every boundary of acceptable behavior, even by Renaissance standards. Alexander delighted in theatrical performances, musical concerts, and dinner parties that attracted cardinals, ambassadors, wealthy merchants, and carefully selected courtesans whose beauty was matched only by their discretion. These gatherings served purposes far beyond mere entertainment. They were demonstrations of papal wealth and power, opportunities for political negotiation, and tests of loyalty among Alexander's supporters. Cardinals who participated found themselves implicated in the Pope's behavior, making them reluctant to criticize or betray him, while those who refused invitations marked themselves as potential enemies. As we step back from that candlelit evening in the Vatican apartments of 1501, we see more than just the story of one corrupt pope. We witness the eternal human struggle between power and principle, between sacred duty and earthly desire. Alexander VI transformed the papacy into a family enterprise, where spiritual authority became a commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited for personal gain. The chestnuts scattered across those marble floors were more than props in a depraved spectacle. They became symbols of how far human dignity can fall when power escapes moral constraint. The man who claimed to hold the keys to heaven had turned the holiest institution on earth into his personal theater of vice. But perhaps most chilling of all is how Alexander's reign nearly succeeded in destroying the Catholic Church from within. His corruption provided ammunition for Protestant reformers who would soon challenge papal authority across Europe. The damage he inflicted took centuries to repair and forever changed how the world viewed religious leadership. The Vatican archives still guard Johannes Burchard's meticulous diary, that clinical record of papal vice, preserved like a confession, hidden beneath layers of pious prayers. Those Latin words continue to whisper across the centuries, reminding us that absolute power, unchecked by conscience or consequence, inevitably corrupts absolutely. Today, as pilgrims walk through those same Vatican halls, now filled with priceless art and reverent tourists, few realize they retreading where history's most scandalous pope once hosted orgies that would make Roman emperors blush. The rooms have been cleansed and consecrated, but the questions Alexander's reign raised about power, faith, and human nature continue to echo through the corridors of history, waiting for each generation to decide what lessons they'll learn from the legacy of the most perverted pope who ever claimed divine authority.